Hey everybody, I've got a question for you. If you had to choose one person to be on a US stamp, who do you think would be most deserving? They couldn't be living, they'd have to be American, and hopefully it'd be somebody who hadn't been on a stamp before. Who would you pick? Personally, I think that's a tough decision, but it'd be interesting to see the results of a poll like that. Well, that sort of happened back in the late 1930s, and it happened at a time when only about 50 people total had ever been featured on a stamp, so almost everyone outside of president types were eligible. The result of the process was what was known as the Famous American Series of Stamps, released in 1940. So who got picked? Are there weird names on there who aren't as famous as they were 85 years ago? Let's find out. So we can start the story at the point when Franklin Roosevelt became president. He took office in the March of 1933. Now, he had a lot of stuff to deal with at the time that was more important than postage stamp designs, if such a thing exists. It was the middle of the Great Depression, and his first 100 days were famous for the insane number of new programs he and the huge Democratic majorities in Congress created under the label of his New Deal agenda. But FDR was famously a big stamp collector, and he was hands-on with the post office and its stamp program. His first year in office, he signed off on the 10-stamp National Park Series, which is one of my personal favorites of all time. He got the ball rolling on what would become the presidential issue definitives, or Prexies, that were released in 1938 and featured every deceased president at the time. He designed the Mother's Day stamp himself, as can be seen in this drawing he did. He wasn't elected for his artistic skill. But there was also a push from the public for FDR to move in a new direction for stamps. This was given a clear voice when something almost like a manifesto ran in Stamps magazine in October 1935, written by Michael Eidsness. Eidsness had been the first director of the Philatelic Agency in the Post Office Department, which was created to be the link between the department and stamp collectors and the public. He held the post from 1921 to 1933, and by all accounts, he was really popular among collectors, so people listened to what he had to say. In his essay, which was split across 2 weeks issues, Eidsness wrote about the educational effects of stamps and the need to honor people outside the realm of politics and war. He gave well over 100 examples of who he thought might qualify, broken into groups based on their area of fame. He listed inventors and scientists, like George Eastman and Wilbur Wright, but not Orville. He was still alive at the time. He listed writers like Jack London and Edgar Allan Poe, artists like Winslow Homer and Benjamin West. He listed distinguished women as their own separate category for some reason. I'm not sure why someone like Emily Dickinson wasn't just listed among the poets, but it was a different time, I guess. There were also sculptors, musicians, architects, and even a miscellaneous group with people like Buffalo Bill Cody and Will Rogers. You can tell his ideas made sense because I just showed you all the stamps those people appeared on, and the movement on this was pretty quick. A set honoring heroes from the Army and Navy was released beginning the next year in 1936, and FDR made a comment while discussing them, saying, "We also may bring out stamps to pay tribute to some of the heroes of peace." Susan B. Anthony turned out to be the first. She was on Eidsness's list. Her stamp was also released in 1936, but a set of 10 or more stamps honoring more heroes of peace gained traction among collectors and eventually the Post Office Department itself. As early as November 1937, Lynn Stamp News reported that plans were well underway for the series and that FDR was in great favor of it. The article said that the post office still needed to reach out to groups in the public for input of who would be featured, but there was a list of over 50 names that were supposed to be the long list currently under consideration by the department for the series. It was again broken into groups with the expectation that 2 or 3 would be picked from each one they decided to feature. The next year, the Washington Evening Star reported that a list of 10 names had been nominated and sent to FDR for final approval. This list had one person per field, and the names were Ralph Waldo Emerson, representing philosophy, Walt Whitman for poetry, Mark Twain for prose, Stephen Collins Foster for music, James Abbott McNeill Whistler for painting, Augustus St. Gaudens for sculpture, Thomas Edison, invention, Horace Mann for education, Walter Reed for medicine, and Jane Addams for sociology. So what do you think? I'd say I'd recognize about 7 or 8 of those names, although I'd only be confident discussing about half of them. Jane Addams and Augustus St. Gaudens are my real blind spots on this. Anyway, there were apparently arguments within the department about who to choose, and a couple months later, Robert Fellers, the superintendent of the Stamps Division at the time, again suggested public input, this time specifically suggesting that university faculties and student bodies weigh in. It eventually became clear that the post office was going back to the idea of having groups of people picked, clustered by specialty, with the suggestion being 5 per group and anywhere between 7 and 12 groups chosen. The public input actually got tabulated and reported, so we can see what people wanted. In the January of 1939, the New York Herald Tribune ran a top 10 list from the Post Office Department, and 6 months later, Stamps Magazine ran another top 10 list, which had the same people on it, but in a slightly different order. The Tribune article isn't clear on the exact sourcing, so it's possible that these are the same polls, and the Stamps article is just from later on in the voting period. Stamps Magazine went into more detail about their poll. It was first announced on their radio show. Yes, there used to be a point in time when there was a regular radio show about stamps. In fact, more than one, and the Stamps Magazine one, called Calling All Stamp Collectors, wasn't even the most popular. The big one was the Ivory Stamp Club with Captain Tim, which was aimed towards kids, and it ran 3 days a week for 15 minutes through most of its run from 1933 to 1941. Captain Tim, real named Reginald Stafford Healy, was an Australian-born Army vet who encouraged people to get into stamp collecting by talking on the show about the stories behind stamps, about rare or valuable stamps, or about forming local stamp clubs, that sort of thing. You could also join Captain Tim's Stamp Club. Apparently the real game changer when it came to getting people into stamp collecting was the albums the show made, along with the packets of stamps you could send away for to fill them. For a few cents and some proof of purchase of Ivory soap products, that was the ivory of the Ivory Stamp Club, you could get either of those things. And apparently 3 million listeners joined the club, and more than 400 million stamps were sent out to subscribers. As an aside, by a weird coincidence, the American Philatelic Society inducted Captain Tim into their Hall of Fame about a month ago, after I had started researching this episode. But like I said, this poll was advertised on the other NBC show, which was aimed more at serious collectors. H.L. Lindquist, who was on the show and published Stamps Magazine, was also the president of the National Federation of Stamp Clubs, so local collector groups were also targeted for input into the survey. And now we're finally back to the question from the beginning of the video. If you were to poll American people from the late 1930s, at least if you consider stamp collectors to be people, who would they say would be most deserving to be on a stamp? Well, the number one answer, apparently by a large margin, was the obvious choice of Frances Willard. I'm going to admit I did not know who that was. Her name does appear in the sea of people mentioned by Michael Eidsness in his essay, but not in the 10 names sent to FDR in 1938, and not even on the 50-person post office long list from 1937. Luckily, Stamps Magazine explained what happened, and it's the basic problem with any poll, where respondents aren't randomly chosen and people get to choose to participate for themselves. Some people take it way too seriously and stuff the ballot box. Willard, if you also didn't know who she was the driving force behind the Women's Christian Temperance Union in the late 19th century. The WCTU was in favor of a number of progressive-era political ideas, but mostly the one in their name, the opposition to alcohol. They ultimately were successful after her death. The 18th Amendment passed and was ratified in 1919, which prohibited alcohol in the United States, at least for 14 years, until the 21st Amendment repealed it. But the WCTU still had hundreds of thousands of members in 1939, and apparently they lobbied their members to vote in the poll. The poll only had about 16,000 votes total, so that was enough to sway the results, hence Willard at number 1. Continuing on the list at number 2 was Edward MacDowell. Again, not somebody I was familiar with, but apparently he was a composer working around the turn of the 20th century. He's another one who appeared on Eidsness's list, but not any other, which makes me think there was another organized campaign to vote for him. His music apparently wasn't as relevant among the general public, even in the 1930s, but his wife was influential in preserving his legacy through the MacDowell Colony and MacDowell Clubs, which were aimed at the general promotion and development of artists of all kinds, not just musicians. The colony actually still exists today as a retreat for artists. Michael Chabon wrote The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay there, which won a Pulitzer. I don't have any evidence that these clubs organized voting for MacDowell, but I suspect something like that happened. From there, the list gets more familiar. Thomas Edison was number 3. Jane Addams was number 4, who, again, I hadn't known, but she at least was on the post office's 10-name shortlist. She was a social activist who won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1931. From there, the list went Will Rogers, Amelia Earhart, Clara Barton, Harriet Beecher Stowe, Alexander Graham Bell, and finally Dwight L. Moody, another blind spot of mine. He was a popular evangelist in the late 19th century. Stamps Magazine then expanded on the results by giving all the leaders of the potential groups that the post office might choose for its release. Authors, poets, artists, composers, patriots and statesmen, educators, inventors, scientists, and religious leaders. It turns out that Amelia Earhart, Will Rogers, and Clara Barton didn't fit well into any of the groups, and weirdly, Thomas Edison, Harriet Beecher Stowe, and Dwight Moody didn't get listed anywhere, even though they all had obvious groups they'd fit into. My guess is that Stamps magazine had some inside info about who had already been vetoed by the post office. You can make an independent argument for excluding Edison, because he sort of already had a stamp back in 1929, but the magazine leaving out Harriet Beecher Stowe from the results just doesn't make sense. Well, until the following week, when Postmaster General James A. Farley made the official announcement of their selections, and the post office's lists were very close to the adjusted predictions given in the magazine. There would only be 7 groups, all the ones I just listed except for the patriots and religious leaders, and there are only a handful of differences from the Stamps lists. It's worth noting that the magazine's lists ended up only including 4 of the top 10 choices from their own poll, so the amount of public input in the end here is less than could have been possible. The final choices also included 9 of the 10 from the original list presented to FDR the previous year, the only exception being Edison. And it turns out the first announcement was the final list, which I'll go over in a second. Stamps did get a lot of letters to the editor about the list. In the olden days, that was apparently where people with strong opinions went to complain about things. I flipped through these issues at the local library, shout out to the Harry S. Mueller Philatelic Collection, by the way, and it was like digging through an ancient internet message board, complete with the required flame wars. Stamps ran a page-long letter by A. Mertz, the director of the American Color Research Laboratory, who had written about stamps in Lindquist publications in the past, and he gave extensive suggestions for changes to the series. That led to a response letter in a later issue, dunking on a couple of factual mistakes Mertz had made, like the idea that Robert Louis Stevenson was a better American author than those on the list, given that Stevenson was Scottish. Mertz wrote a response to the response, closing it with, "The balance of Mr. Johnson's letter was too controversial for me to answer. Controversy becomes endless and gets nowhere. Please let us stick to the point and avoid controversy," which is what you write when the dunking is too strong. Anyway, let's take a look at the famous American series and who made the list. As I already mentioned, these were split into 7 groups. Each group had 5 stamps, a 1 cent, 2 cent, 3 cent, 5 cent, and 10 cent stamp, and people were assigned to their denominations by birth date. The oldest got the 1 cent stamp, the most recent got the 10 cent stamp. The first day of issues ran from January 29th all the way to October 28th in 1940, with 1 or 2 stamps being released on each date, and going in order through a group before moving on to the next one. Ceremonies were held in places that were relevant to the person depicted. Booker T. Washington's was at the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, for instance, and Washington Irving's was in Tarrytown, New York. The first group were the prose authors. The 1 cent stamp was the Washington Irving one I just mentioned. He wrote Rip Van Winkle and The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, which actually got its own stamp in 1974. The 2 cent was for James Fenimore Cooper, who wrote The Last of the Mohicans, and the 3 cent stamp was for the transcendentalist Ralph Waldo Emerson. The 5 cent and 10 cent stamps featured Louisa May Alcott and Samuel Clemens, better known as Mark Twain, who actually both had books featured in 1993's classic book series, Little Women and Huck Finn. The next group of stamps honored poets. The first 3 were actually associated with each other as part of the group known as the Fireside Poets. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow on the 1 cent, John Greenleaf Whittier on the 2 cent, and James Russell Lowell on the 3 cent. The 5 cent stamp featured Walt Whitman, and the 10 cent was for James Whitcomb Riley. The third group featured famous American educators, and we start getting into the people who I am not familiar with. The 1 cent was for Horace Mann, who was a major figure in promoting universal public education in the US and professionalizing the job of teaching. The 2 cent stamp was for Mark Hopkins, who was an especially good teacher. You can scroll for a while before getting that Mark Hopkins as a Google result, and putting his name into Wikipedia leads to a disambiguation page instead of just assuming you meant him, which is probably a sign that his influence has not held up. The 3 cent stamp has Charles W. Eliot, who was president of Harvard University for 40 years and had a big influence on the development of college education over the late 19th century. The 5 cent stamp is Francis Willard, who I already discussed, and the 10 cent stamp is Booker T. Washington. This was actually the first time a Black American was featured on a stamp. Washington was the first president of the Tuskegee Institute, but his influence extended beyond education and into the general racial politics of the post-Reconstruction South. Group 4 were the scientists, although some people complain that there are almost no actual scientists chosen. The 1 cent stamp was for John J. Audubon, who is best known for his paintings of birds. He's been honored on a surprising number of stamps over the years. I don't even have them all. The 2 cent was Crawford Long, who developed the practice of using ether as an anesthetic in surgery, and the 3 cent was Luther Burbank, who was a horticulturist who bred a large number of plant species over his career. Walter Reed was on the 5-cent stamp, who established that yellow fever was transmitted by mosquitoes, and the 10-cent stamp had Jane Addams, who I previously mentioned. The next group was American composers. The 1 cent was Stephen Foster, who wrote classics like Oh Susanna, Camptown Races, and My Old Kentucky Home. The 2 cent was John Philip Sousa, the one name I recognized here, who wrote a bunch of famous marches. The 3, 5, and 10 cents were Victor Herbert, Edward MacDowell, and Ethelbert Nevin. They were all composers, I guess. I discussed MacDowell before, but I can't really find a hook for why Ethelbert Nevin would be still known today. The second to last group were the artists. Gilbert Stuart is on the 1 cent stamp, whose most famous painting is the Athenaeum portrait of George Washington. It's the one on the $1 bill and a bunch of different stamps. James Whistler is on the 2 cent stamp. I already showed his painting of his mother in this video. Augustus St. Gaudens on the 3 cent stamp was a sculptor who has works in some prominent places, like Chicago's Lincoln Park, the Boston Common, and New York's Central Park. The 5 cent stamp was for David Chester French, who did the Lincoln Memorial sculpture and the Minuteman statue that appeared on this stamp from 1923. The 10 cent was for Frederick Remington, who is known for his Western American art, some of which appeared on the second ever set of commemorative stamps issued for the Trans-Mississippi Exposition. The last group were inventors. Eli Whitney was on the 1 cent stamp. He invented the cotton gin and developed the mass production concept of interchangeable parts. The 2 cent stamp was Samuel Morse, who invented the telegraph. The first message he sent, the biblical quote, "What hath God wrought?" was used on the stamp celebrating the centenary of the telegraph in 1944. Cyrus McCormick is on the 3 cent stamp. He developed one of the first successful mechanical reapers for harvesting crops. The 5 cent stamp has Elias Howe, who invented a successful sewing machine. The very last stamp of the series was for Alexander Graham Bell, the telephone guy. So there you go. Those are the 35 names the post office chose in 1940 as being deserving of appearing on a stamp. I'll admit I recognized about half of those names, although some of them I recognize for stuff named after them and not for the people themselves. Walter Reed Hospital was in the news a while back, and Wichita has a school named after Horace Mann. Like I said, there were people complaining at the time that some of the names were not notable enough for a stamp, but if we reran this exercise today, I bet most of these names would not come to the top of the list. But that raises the question, who would win such a poll if we reran it today? Well, we sort of had something like this with the Celebrate the Century series in the late 1990s. People were given a short list of potential stamp subjects for each of the decades between 1950 and 1990, and they could make the final choice of who got featured. I did an entire video about the series if you want more details. It got a lot more participation from the general public than the Stamps magazine poll, like millions of votes, and it wasn't just members of stamp clubs. On the flip side, very few individuals were options for stamps. They tended to be events or cultural artifacts, and it wasn't open-ended. You couldn't nominate whoever you wanted. The polling company Gallup used to ask a question to Americans annually about who the most admired man and woman were, which again isn't a perfect fit. They had to be living people. It was also usually pretty boring. Presidents and first ladies dominated, although Margaret Thatcher and Mother Teresa had a good run. Gallup did run a variation in 1999, though, where they asked about the most admired people from the entire 20th century, and today all of the choices, except Bill Clinton, are deceased. The winner was Mother Teresa, who had just passed away a couple years before the poll was taken, and was not American. But the next were good examples of who I think might win that sort of poll today. Martin Luther King, JFK, Einstein, Helen Keller. All of these people have already been on stamps, actually. Again, though, this wasn't an open-ended poll. There wasn't a chance for an organized effort to have a Frances Willard-type surprise winner. I'm also curious as to how well people more on the pop culture end of things would do. The Kennedys were actually on the ballot for the 1960s Celebrate the Century sheet, but they didn't make it. They lost out to subjects like the Beatles and Woodstock and the Green Bay Packers. What would a famous composers list look like today? Would Aaron Copland make the list? Can I name 4 other American composers? My guess would be that the group would be rebranded as famous musicians, and people like Elvis and Michael Jackson would win. With all that said, MLK took 4th in the voting for the 1960s sheet, so it's not like all the serious historical figures lost out. And that kind of gets at one of the big differences between the 1930s and today. We've already honored a lot of people on stamps. I can't find an exact count, but the number is probably somewhere around 1,000, which is very different than when Michael Eisness was writing in 1935. The number was 43. MLK's already gotten 2 stamps. Deservedly so, but he probably doesn't need another one right away. What's cool is that leaves the Citizen Stamp Advisory Committee open to celebrate people on stamps who might not be obvious choices. and in some ways that better serves the educational purpose Eidsness was talking about. Chief Standing Bear was honored with this stamp back in May. Did you know he successfully sued in federal court back in 1879 to allow Native Americans for the first time to be recognized as having civil rights protections under the Constitution? I'll admit that I didn't. It was important though, even if Standing Bear wouldn't have come anywhere close to the top 100 in a poll for who deserved to be on a stamp. So who do you think should be on a stamp? You can let me know in the comments, or you can contact the Citizen Stamp Advisory Committee directly. They take public input. I'll put a link in the description of the video. Going back to the 1930s poll, 5 of the 6 in the top 10 that were left off eventually did get stamps, with Harriet Beecher Stowe being the most recent in 2007. The only one that's left is Dwight L. Moody, so all of you Keswickian Christians out there, start writing some letters. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, check out some of the other ones on my channel. If you feel bad for Thomas Edison being left out of the Famous Americans, don't worry. He got a stamp shortly after that looks very similar to something in the series.